So as I hope you all know, today I'm going to talk about the increasing support for what is called Christian nationalism. So you know a lot about this. And that's the idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and its laws should reflect the Christian values as articulated by Christian nationalists. I'm going to tell you flat out where I stand on this. It's in the title. I think this whole idea is un-American and unchristian, and its support among a growing number of Americans is a threat to all of us, as well as to Christianity itself. I'm a lawyer, and I intend, therefore, to prove these propositions beyond a reasonable doubt. This is not a position I've come to recently. This op-ed was published in the Indianapolis Star on August the 16th, 2012. And here's what I wrote more than 12 years ago. As our founding fathers recognized, a real American is not defined by religious beliefs. A real American believes, regardless of his or her own faith traditions, in the idea of religious pluralism and freedom upon which our country was founded, which continues to draw to our shores people with many religious beliefs and practices. It is that ideal that we Americans have in common, whether we were born Methodist in rural Indiana, which is me, or in any other religious tradition in any other part of the world. Those who attack that ideal are attacking the very essence of what holds us together and makes us great. But unfortunately, as we all know, this ideal of religious pluralism is under attack. On June the 19th, 2024, Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry signed into law a bill requiring all Louisiana public classrooms, from elementary schools to universities, to display a copy of the Ten Commandments. The sponsor of a similar bill in Oklahoma said, quote, "The Ten Commandments is one of the foundations of our nation." On June the 27th, 2024, the Oklahoma superintendent of schools said that all schools in the district teach the Bible, whatever that means. In explaining his decision, he said, quote, "The Bible is one of the most historically significant books and a cornerstone of Western civilization, along with the Ten Commandments." It is not clear whether the Oklahoma schools are to teach the Roman Catholic version of the Bible, which includes 73 books, or the Protestant version, which includes only 66 books. It's also not clear which of the many translations of the Bible Oklahoma schools are to teach. All those ideas, all those details seem irrelevant to the idea that the Bible and the Ten Commandments underlie the laws and traditions of the United States. As we will see, that is simply a myth at best and a blatant lie at worst. Christian nationalism is not only on the rise in places such as Oklahoma and Louisiana. Micah Beckwith, the Republican candidate for Indiana Lieutenant Governor, is an avowed Christian nationalist, seeking to put Christianity above the Constitution in his words. According to a recent survey shown here, you can find Indiana on the map. 40% of all Hoosiers support the ideas underlying Christian nationalism. And so let's look at those ideas. There's a common assumption, perhaps you share, that because the earliest European settlers in what became the United States were Christians, the founding fathers were also Christians. But religious beliefs had changed dramatically between when the Puritans began settling in North America and when the founding fathers began considering a separation from England. By the middle of the 18th century, American religious beliefs had been greatly influenced by the so-called Enlightenment in Europe and the writings of John Locke, Isaac Newton, and others. From those writings came a religious tradition called deism, a belief that God created the universe and the laws, gave humans the power to reason, and essentially got out of the way. Deists in general rejected all texts claimed to have divine origins and rejected accounts of miracles that would violate the laws of God. Many, if not most, of our founding fathers either acknowledged deists or articulated religious views consistent with deism. Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet Common Cause provided much of the impetus after the Declaration of Independence, was an acknowledged deist who opposed all forms of organized religion. Here's what he said, writing in the Age of Reason, quote, "People in general do not know what wickedness there is in this pretended word of God. Good heavens. It is quite another thing. It is a book of lies, wickedness, and blasphemy. For what can be greater blasphemy than to describe the wickedness of man to the orders of the Almighty?" George Washington periodically attended church near Mount Vernon, but he consciously did not take communion, from which the church leaders at the time considered that he was not a real Christian. He often spoke of providence, the great architect, and other formulations for the deity, but to Christ in only a handful of instances. One author recently concluded, quote, "By the standards of 21st century conservative evangelical Christians, Washington was not Christian because he did not accept Jesus as his personal savior and rejected the Bible as God's revelation." John Adams was especially influenced by Enlightenment theists such as John Locke, who argued that reason applied to faith. As one author states, quote, "He came to reject major parts of Orthodox Christian theology, including the Trinity, original sin, and justification by faith." Like the deists, Adams believed in a God who created the universe and its laws, but concluded that Christianity had become infected with, quote, "millions of fables, tales, legends, and become the most bloody religion that ever existed." The views of Thomas Jefferson are probably the best known of the founding fathers, in part because he created a Bible called the Jefferson Bible that eliminated all the claimed miracles, including the virgin birth and the resurrection of Jesus. Jefferson believed that Jesus had been a great moral teacher, but denied that he had been born divine. Where Jefferson, quote, "The authors of the canonical gospels were ignorant, unfettered men, laid a groundwork of vulgar ignorance, of things impossible, of superstitions, fanaticisms, and fabrications." Here's what he said about Paul, who created many of the writings of the New Testament, quote, "Of this band of dupes and imposters, Paul was the great Perfius and the first corrupter of the doctrines of Jesus." Benjamin Franklin publicly acknowledged being a deist. As one author knows, quote, "It was the perfect theology for someone like him, because it imagined a holy inventor who wrote the natural laws and then gave humans the brains to master nature." Like most deists, Franklin believed that all religions were basically the same and came to believe that religious toleration was vital to a free society. Franklin did not attend church and was openly critical of Christianity. Quote, he wrote acidly that Christians declare themselves better than other faiths and offered examples of pagans, heathens, and Muslims who were more generous than Christians. Like Jefferson, Franklin rejected all the miracles in the Bible, including the virgin birth and the resurrection of Jesus. Of the founding fathers, the only one whose known views do not rule out him being considered an Orthodox Christian is James Madison. And the reason for this is simple. Unlike all the others we have discussed, Madison said essentially nothing about his faith. One author says, quote, "Unlike Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin, who spelled out their theology over and over again, at different stages, Madison left only small clues." But what we do know about Madison's belief is that he was fiercely in favor of religious freedom. From the time he was 22, Madison, quote, "came down firmly on the side of religious freedom, arguing that only liberty of conscience could guarantee civil and political liberty." So those are the founding fathers. With this understanding of their views, we can now turn to the documents that they wrote and approved. As we will see, those documents are fundamentally inconsistent with the notion that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. Let's first look at the Declaration of Independence, this original soiled copy, which Christian nationalists often argue embraces Judeo-Christian principles. In the first place, it's important to understand that the Declaration of Independence didn't establish anything. It simply declared the right of the colonies to be free from England. So as one author correctly notes, what the Constitution not the Declaration, created our government and laws. But more important, and perhaps this will surprise you, the Declaration of Independence is itself an anti-Christian document. Its purpose was to reject allegiance to King George III, the head of the Church of England, who everyone assumed held this title lawfully. As a result, Christians were admonished to obey the rightfully established king. As Paul wrote in his letter to the Romans, quote, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities exist, have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authorities, rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves." This and similar ideas, biblical teachings, were used by loyalist ministers, both in the United States and abroad, to preach against independence. For example, Jonathan Boucher was an Anglican minister in Maryland, one of the colonies. He argued that seeking independence was against God's will, because the only circumstances relevant to government for which the scriptures seem to be particularly solicitous is inculcating obedience to lawful government. He wrote, quote, "Obedience to government is every man's duty, because every man's interest was particularly incumbent on Christians, because it is enjoined by the positive commands of God."
Divine right of king.
Right, divine right of kings. Under Christian teachings, you're one step ahead here, right?
Sorry.
Kings ruled with divine authority, and therefore could be overruled only by God or God's authority. But the Declaration of Independence does not rely on God's authority or God's laws to justify rejecting the authority of King George, instead appealing exclusively to self-evident truths. So John Lind was an English barrister who supported King George. He said that's enough to reject outright this whole declaration. In a document called An Answer to the Declaration, he wrote, "If to what they now demand they're entitled to by any law of God, they only had to produce that law, and all controversy was in the end. Instead of this, what do they produce? What they claim self-evident truths. All men, they tell us, are created equal." But Jefferson obviously could not rely on any law of God, because the laws of God opposed the whole idea of independence. The Declaration of Independence, therefore, is fundamentally inconsistent with biblical teachings about a government source of authority. According to the Bible, kings ruled with God's consent. But the Declaration of Independence proclaims that governments rule with the consent of the governed. If the governments fail to achieve that consent, it is the quote right of the people to alter or abolish it. Because nothing in the Declaration of Independence said anything about governments ruling with the consent or authority of God. One of says, quote, "It directly contradicts Christian principles of governmental authority." There are 4 references in the Declaration of Independence that Christian nationalists argue reflect Judeo-Christian values. Only 4. They reference to the laws of nature, nature's God, their creator, supreme judge of the world, and divine providence. The first of these 4 references was in Thomas Jefferson's original draft. The others were added by the Continental Congress before the adoption of the Declaration. But before we look at these individual references, we can say with certainty one thing that applies to all 4 of them. Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin, the primary authors of the Declaration of Independence, and the Continental Congress could have chosen to root the entitlements, endowments, appeals, and protections in Jesus Christ or any other specific God. But they did not. Instead, they carefully selected references that do not specify any religious denomination or sectarian belief. In fact, look at the date here. So careful were the authors of the Declaration of Independence to avoid any reference to any particular God or deities that they intentionally omitted the customary phrase "in the year of our Lord from the date. The laws of nature and nature's God are not Christian terms. To the extent that they refer to any particular religious tradition, they are references to the deist traditions held by Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin, all of whom contributed to the Declaration of Independence. One author knows, quote, the nature's God of Jefferson's Declaration was not a Calvinist God, but a deist God of natural religion discovered through reason. John Adams, one of the people who contributed those words, equated nature's God with natural laws, saying once in a letter to Jefferson, we can never be so certain of any prophecy or the fulfillment of any prophecy or any miracle or the designs of any miracle as we are from the revelation of nature. That is nature's God, that 2 and 2 are equal to 4. At the time of the Declaration of Independence, Christians considered deist ideas about laws of nature and nature's God to be heretical, not Christian. Priests condemned those who believe that there is no other divinity or sovereign power in the world except nature, that God is nature and nature is God. Here is the text from Thomas Jefferson's first draft at the top of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent, and from that equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. That's not quite what you all remember from the Declaration of Independence, right?
Right.
The adopted language differs slightly from Jefferson's draft. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the Continental Congress added the word their creator to the Declaration. So are Christians right? Christian nationalists right when they claim that their creator refers to Judeo-Christian God? Well, as you all know, in pre-Darwin times, virtually all religious traditions in the world believed that man had been created, and they had different creation stories. The deists believed that, as did the Hindus, the Muslims, the Sikhs, and the Aztecs, among many others. And if man was created, there was in fact always a creator. So in Hinduism, the creator was the god Brahma. For the Aztecs, the creator god was Tezcatlipoca, and for the Muslims, it was Allah. And notice that the phrase added is not the creator or our creator, much less God or Father, or other terms that might suggest the Christian God. Instead, it is their creator, which referred to whatever or whomever had created the man that had been created equal. There's, of course, no significance to the fact that creator is capitalized. So are life, liberty, and happiness. So as a result, readers are meant to interpret this phrase as referring to whichever creator, God or otherwise, they believe in. The appeal in the final paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, as adopted by the Continental Congress to the Supreme Judge of the world, no more refers to a specific divine judge than does their creator. Many religions, beginning with the ancient Egyptians, believed in divine judgment for human actions while alive. Muslims believe this, Zoroastrians believe this, other traditions also believe in a God of judgment. To the extent that the Supreme Judge of the world refers to divine judgment, it is not exclusively Christian or even Judeo-Christian. Finally, the Declaration seeking the protection of divine providence also does not suggest a uniquely Christian belief, but instead a widespread belief shared by some deists that the gods, plural gods, have some effect on human destiny, or at least on the destiny of some groups of people. The word providence does not appear in the King James Bible. The Bible was available to the founding fathers. It's derived from the Latin term providentia, which means foresight. So who first talked about providence? Seneca. The Roman Stoic philosopher could never be confused with a Christian, formulated the religious connotation of providence, an essay trying to reconcile the benevolence of the gods with evil in the world. As John Meacham writes, quote, the supreme judge of the world and divine providence were no more specific to the God of the Bible and creator and nature's God. So in summary, to the extent the Declaration of Independence refers to any religious ideas, those ideas are in common with most religious traditions, including Islam, Hinduism, and the religion of the Roman Stoics. Unlike every prior document, I'm going to underline every prior document establishing governments, including those in the colonies, the United States Constitution makes no reference to God or any higher power, and includes no language that can even be construed to suggest a religious purpose or intent. Even the prescribed oath, the president admitted the traditional ending, "So help me God." That was added by later presidents because it wasn't in the Constitution. Shortly after the Constitution Convention had ended, someone asked Alexander Hamilton why it made no reference to God. He replied sarcastically, "I guess we forgot."
Yep.
But the absence of a reference to God or any other deity or religious ideas was not an oversight. As one author has written, in light of the unbroken record of invoking God's name in foundational documents throughout the world, throughout the colonies and throughout history, the stubborn refusal of the U.S. Constitution to invoke the Almighty is abnormal, historic, radical, and not accidental. Another author writes, "With the lack of a reference to God or religious purpose in the Constitution should not be surprising, considering the religious beliefs of the men involved and their impression of the task at hand." Unlike all prior governments, governmental power under the Constitution did not come from God, but from the people. This idea did not come from Christian teachings, but from ancient Greece and Rome. And because power from the people came from the people and not from God, the Constitution expressly stated no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification of any office or public trust under the United States. As one author said, this provision highlighted the secular nature of the Constitution and the new government's non-reliance on religious principles. During the ratification debates, opponents of this provision expressed objections that seemed all too consistent with current views. One person feared that pagans, deists, and Mohammedans might obtain offices among us. Another word, if the president were Jewish, quote, "Our dear posterity may be ordered to rebuild Jerusalem." But despite those objections, the Constitution with this provision in it was ratified. Before the ratification of the Constitution by the states, James Madison introduced in the House of Representatives a set of amendments to the Constitution that became known as the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment, says, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people peacefully assembled, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." All early presidents acting under the Constitution, all early presidents understood it did not establish a Christian nation or anything of the sort. In the first 20 annual presidential addresses, neither George Washington, nor John Adams, nor Thomas Jefferson ever uttered the name Jesus or Christ. During the first term of his presidency, George Washington wrote, quote, "The bosom of America is open to receive the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to participation of all our rights and privileges." 1797, John Adams, author of the Declaration, author of Declaration of Independence, promoter of the Constitution, presented to the Senate, and the Senate ratified a treaty with Tripoli, seeking to bring an end to battles with the Barbary pirates. Let's read this. Article 11. As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as has been in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religions, tranquility of Mussulman, that means Muhammad, or as said states never entering any war, except hostility against a nation, is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. As John Meacham writes, quote, Article 11 defines the federal government as secular, not religious. John Adams was a contributor to the Declaration of Independence and an architect of the Constitution. This treaty should be all that you need to reject the claims of Christian nationalists that the United States was founded on the Christian religion. 1803, President Jefferson, third president, wrote a letter to the Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut. They had been complaining to him that Connecticut was discriminating against them in favor of the congregation, which the established religion of the state. And this letter, which had been reviewed by his attorney general, stated, quote, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people is declared that the legislature should, quote, make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise of, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. People today will tell you that those words were invented by liberals on the Supreme Court. They're actually spoken first by our third president, Thomas Jefferson. In his autobiography written in 1821, Jefferson wrote that the Virginia statute for religious freedom, which he considered the model for the First Amendment, quote, comprehended within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and Mohammedan, the Hindu and infidel of every denomination. James Madison, our fourth president, was considered the father of the Constitution and the chaperone of the First Amendment. During his term, in almost every action, he conveyed support for strict separation of church and state. So let's look at the Ten Commandments. This Christian nationalist claim is a foundational doctrine of the United States. Before I go further, let me make clear where I stand on this subject. It is absurd. In the first place, there is no such thing as the Ten Commandments. Let's look at these posters. Each claiming to be the Ten Commandments. Well, each contains 10 statements. The 10 are not the same. The one on the left ignores the prohibition on the worship of idols and separates the prohibition of coveting into two separate commandments, unlike the version on the right. And the version on the left prohibits killing, while the one on the right prohibits murder. Killing and murder are obviously not the same thing. The Supreme Court case involving the Ten Commandments, Justice Anton Scalia, a Roman Catholic, wrote this: I doubt that most religious adherents are even aware that they're competing versions of the Ten Commandments. With doctrinal consequences, friend, I certainly was not. So, but for the moment, let's ignore all issues about which version of the Ten Commandments we should be imposing, and which supposedly influence our laws, and consider an abbreviated version, the one that the Louisiana schools must display. It's based on the movie The Ten Commandments, but didn't think they could get all the words on the stone tablets.
A great movie.
So which of these commandments could have had any effect on either our founding documents or our laws? The prohibition against having no other gods is directly contrary to the Constitution. We have no federal laws that have ever prohibited graven images or taking the name of the Lord in vain, except perhaps in the context of false oaths. We have no laws about honoring our fathers and mothers or coveting, except perhaps when the coveting leads to stealing. We have Sunday closing laws, but they cannot be based on the Ten Commandments because the Sabbath, the Jewish day of rest, is from Friday evening to Saturday evening, not Sunday. So the only possible commandments that could have had any effect on our laws are those prohibiting killing, adultery, stealing, and bearing false witness. We can also say perjury. So as Warren knows, quote, it is not until halfway through God's most moral precepts we even begin to see at least some semblance to American law and government. But laws against killing, adultery, stealing, and perjury are not exclusive or original to Judeo-Christianity. They're universal principles that all humans understand and arrive at regardless of their participation in the Judeo-Christian religion. Those prohibitions against stealing, adultery, theft, and false witness killing are all in the Code of Ur-Nammu from Mesopotamia, written on stone tablets in Sumerian language in 2100 BC, 900 years before Moses. Now, I want you to think about this. The claim that the Israelites got the laws from God through Moses, what does it say about what they were doing before that? Did they think killing and stealing and adultery were just okay until God told them no? That's ridiculous. Civilizations throughout history have punished stealing, murder, adultery, and perjury. And many of the laws that the Bible says were given to Moses are largely restatements of much of earlier Middle Eastern laws, including the famous Code of Hammurabi. So, that's the Code of Hammurabi. So, with the claim that laws based on the Ten Commandments are now out of the way, let's turn to my final argument. Christian nationalism was un-Christian and dangerous to our democracy. There are a number of books on this topic. One written in 2023 by Andrew Whitehead, who you heard, Indiana University professor, and what you perhaps don't know, he's a committed Christian raised in the evangelical tradition. The book is entitled American Idolatry: How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. He writes, quote, Christian nationalists neglect the vital aspects of the gospel, like loving your neighbor, seeking justice, and caring for widows and orphans. 2024 book, co-authored by Bo Underwood, was here earlier in the week, the senior pastor of the Allisonville Christian Church in Indianapolis, flatly concludes, over and over, social science has found a troubling association between strong expressions of Christian nationalism and a variety of retrograde viewpoints. Another writes, quote, by the time Trump arrived on the scene proclaiming himself their savior, Christian nationalists had already traded a faith that privileges humility and elevates the least of these for one that derides gentleness as the province of wusses. Rather than turning the other cheek, they resolved to defend their faith and their nation, secure in the knowledge that the ends justify the means.
That's our book that you all need to read before Carol leads a discussion on it.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that in November. November.
So
Now.
So let's look at some of the evidence that support these claims made by Christian authors. First, the Bible, which the Christian nationalist claims their guidebook, repeatedly mandates that immigrants be treated justly and with respect. For example, Leviticus commands, quote, the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Deuteronomy is similar. God defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you're to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. Malachi says, quote, so I will come near to you for judgment. I will be quick to testify against sorcerers, adulterers, and perjurers, against those who defraud laborers of their wages, who oppress the widows and the fatherless, and deprive aliens of justice. But do not fear me, says the Lord. Despite these expressed teachings, Christian nationalists are far more likely than other Americans to want to restrict or eliminate immigration entirely. As Andrew Whitehead says, and I will be here, study after study identifies white Christian nationalism as a cultural framework fostering much of the antipathy American Christians report toward immigrants and refugees. According to a survey conducted by Public Religion Research Institute, 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants, which is a good proxy for Christian nationalists, believe that immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background, compared with only 17% of the religious, 22% of the, 17% of the religiously unaffiliated. And then like every other religious group, majority of that same group supports passing a law to ban all refugees from the United States. Majority, compared to only 22% religiously unaffiliated. And I want you to look at this and see how well Christianity as a whole does on some of these matters. The most tolerant groups among us are not Christians. So next slide. Pastor Underwood's book flatly states, quote, the racism of Christian nationalism today is important to recognize. The author said, quote, the white Christian nationalist version of patriotism racist, xenophobic, patriarchal, and exclusionary. For Christians who seek to be anti-racist, as some mainline Protestants profess as a goal, including us, the danger of Christian nationalist ideas runs deeper than just issues at church and state. It can also undermine work in areas to combat racism, misogyny, and other heresies. Especially at Christmas time, Christians quote Isaiah, which predicted the Messiah who would be called the Prince of Peace. During his life on earth, Jesus lived up to that advanced building. During the Sermon on the Mount, he said, quote, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Jesus famously told his followers, I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek as well. When authorities came to arrest Jesus, one of his disciples cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And Jesus said, put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Yeah. Despite these expressed teachings of Jesus, quote, the millions of white Americans who favor Christian nationalism support the use of firearms to enact violence whenever they deem it necessary. And their it says, quote, waging war, gun violence, the death penalty, and rioting to the Capitol are all acceptable forms of violence under the right circumstances. A 2021 survey showed that 9 out of 10 white Christians who strongly embrace Christian nationalism agree with the statement, the best way to stop a bad guy with guns is to arm good guys with guns. As you see here, only 37% of evangelical Protestants favor stricter gun controls, compared to 76% of Black Protestants and 61% of those with no religious affiliation. Professor Whitehead, along with others, sees in this additional evidence of racism. Quote, the righteousness of violence is limited to those like us, which naturally excludes racial and ethnic minorities. I could go on and on with similar examples, but you get the point. Christian nationalist views are the opposite of what most of us here believe are authentic Christian values, the ones that originated with Jesus. Next slide. The unchristian nature of Christian nationalism is a threat to the very existence of Christianity. More and more people, you know this, especially young people, have become convinced that the views of Christian nationalists are Christianity, and they're having nothing to do with it.
Right.
Professor Whitehead, a faithful Christian, writes, quote, gaining and selfishly employing political power has not served to bring more Americans into the Christian fold. Study after study demonstrates that one effect of the cultural warring of the Christian right was to actively push people out of the Christian tradition. And our effort to retain what we thought was a Christian nation, we've succeeded in pushing more Americans away from the faith. Next. Christian nationalism is a very threat to our democracy. A very recent study, September study, by the Public Religion Research Institute found a strong correlation between Christian nationalist belief and support for an authoritarian national government. Dr. Melissa Deckman, the CEO of the Institute, said this about the study. While most Americans do not espouse authoritarian views, our study demonstrates that such views are disproportionately held by Christian nationalists, who we know in our past research have been more prone to accept political violence and more likely to hold anti-democratic attitudes than other Americans. In the aftermath of the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the United States Capitol, much has been written demonstrating Christian nationalist beliefs at the heart of that violence. One entire book by a committed Christian lays out the evidence for that in great detail. It's called Only Sheep Preparing for War. And another author concludes writing a postscript after the January 6th insurrection, quote, America's latest wave of Christian nationalism, Trump's wave, will culminate in this attack. But Christian nationalists did not die on January 6th. And may even be more dangerous now, with adherents convinced that God's plan for white Christian America was stolen. Andrew Whitehead, a professor Christian, is adamant that it's up to Christians who oppose Christian nationalists to act and to act now. Here's what he writes. The January 6th insurrection will not be the last example of violence suffused with Christian symbolism, unless and until American Christians consistently confront Christian nationalism. To oppose white Christian nationalism is not to give up on Christianity. Christianity can be marked by sacrifice, hope, grace, services, faith, and of course, love. Christians can disentangle our faith from Christian nationalism and thus more closely embody the life, the teachings of Jesus, the gospel in our congregations and communities. Another author writes, quote, the sad truth is that the silence of mainline churches has made the Christian right grow even bolder. And yet another writes, quote, so far the hopes of our founders have never been fully proven right. And yet they have never been fully proven entirely wrong. Once again, we're at a time of testing. How it comes out rests, as it always has, in our hands. We'll come before that.
No, that's it.
Oh, that's it, okay. In my opinion, it's a time for us who see the world much differently from Christian nationalists to counter their false narratives with better stories, better narratives, helping to promote what Jesus really said about the poor, violence. Immigrants is a good place to start. I don't have to tell anyone here that. But getting more involved in the political process is another way. As the author of one of the books I've quoted repeatedly writes, quote, as the myths of Christian nationalists are proclaimed with more desperation, we must be prepared to refute them factually and vocally. This book provides the first half of that recipe. You're responsible for the rest. Outspoken resistance is, as Madison might say, quote, the first duty of citizens. Okay. How about, I guess, 7 or 8 minutes to take questions or comments?
And let me say 2 quick things. Sorry. Thank you,
Yeah.
Don. One, we have a resource guide that has a lot of those on it on our website. So we've just been adding to it and coming up things. So look for the resources list. And secondly, as I sort of yelled from the back, but the Bradley Onishi book, Preparing for War, Carol's going to lead a discussion on in about a month from now. So if you are interested in reading that, there'll be 2 different.
Start now, it's heavy.
Start now. And come even if you don't read it. The discussions are good even if you don't read it. So
Well, exactly.
But thanks.
So thanks again for the chance to do this. I tried to summarize everything to be said on this topic in 45 minutes, which I think I did.
You did.
It's a lot.
Comments, thoughts, questions? Yes, all the way back. Frank?
Yeah, I want to commend you for this. I'm quite pleased, and I heard you invoke the name of John Meacham, who is probably the most intelligent man on the subject in America, and gets to say so verbally, you know. I'm just so pleased, and having been educated deeply in government, both undergraduate and graduate, and having been a government employee and throughout, I'm flawed but steady Protestant. This is quite good. And I was miffed the other night when there was discussion, and I forget the minister was.
Bo Underwood was here.
I was shocked at the way he was approaching things. I said, geez, I came prepared. I in essence said, I came prepared to take on those damned evangelists. They're giving Protestantism a bad name.
They are.
Okay?
They're giving Christianity a bad name.
That's good, yeah, and so on and so forth, and, even down to the flag, I would have liked to had presence of mind to rebuke him on that Navy flag that flew, that it's always been, at least since I was a young man, at the pulpit of every Protestant mainline church in America, as far as I know. It was a Navy flag, it's got the cross, the blue background, and the white, and which I noticed a few years ago was removed from our altar, and I didn't recall that anybody in the Presbyterian Church gave an explanation as to why. Okay, but in any event, I
Is
will.
that your question, Frank?
Yeah.
Anybody else has a
I
question?
would like to ask why.
Yes, other questions?
We are, so to your question as to why.
Yeah.
And when, we're actually in the process of figuring all of that out. So I wasn't here, so I don't have the,
You can blame it on the previous administration.
well, but I don't want to do that either. I want to make sure that I have pretty clear history of what happened. So anyone in this room that was here during that time that has some of that history and would like to share that with me or with Karen. Karen's in the back corner, that's why I'm pointing back there. Not pointing to mythological Karen somewhere else, actually right there. Please do so. You can send us an email or give us a call or stop us in the hall. We'd love to collect that information for sure, just so we have, it's part of putting all the history together of Northminster Presbyterian Church.
Somebody have, go back here, yes.
It appears that to fight the Christian national movement, you're saying that it must come from the other branches of Christianity,
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
and that those branches should come together and fight in a good way. Those,
Opposed. That's what I'm
because
saying.
the people who are outside of Christianity, I think would be looked upon as being anti-Christian. So it's more important for the Christians to band together, and my question is, are they?
There's certainly a lot of this discussion going on. I mean, the guys like Andrew Whitehead, who's fortunately local, and Bo Underwood, who's fortunately local, and this church, which is obviously local, are doing this. I just the other day got an email from a person I hadn't seen for 30 years who said, congratulations on doing this. I'm doing this at my church, which is designed to go Christian church. So there are congregations doing this. I don't know how many.
And we're in Indiana, which means it's happening here.
So, but I want to emphasize that. If Christians of your persuasion, our persuasion, don't come out and say that's not us, the non-Christian part of the world can believe it is us. It is
They
us.
already do.
The anti-immigrant, anti-ethnic, anti-gay, all that stuff, they can believe Christians, you know that.
Yeah.
Christians believe, they take that belief of the loudest ones and attribute that to us, because we're not out there saying that's a bunch of crap. We're not saying that.
Sure.
We're saying it in here.
Right.
We're saying it in here. We say it to ourselves. We're not saying it to the world,
Public square.
public square. Yes,
Has our denomination come out with a statement?
Yeah, that's on the resource page, correct, Jen?
Yeah.
So, the denomination has a really well done, several page document on it.
It's from 2018.
Yeah, when it was a part of the General Assembly, so it actually predates most of the most recent stuff.
yes, right here.
Not that the Catholics are non-Christians, but what are we doing with other organizations such as the Catholic Church the Jewish community that I cannot believe, you know, I think the more we get together,
You're exactly right. I think the Jewish people have the same problem. We're talking about the non-Christian people, which is they're just attacking the Christians, right? I don't know what the Catholic position is. Somebody may know that.
It's diverse.
Diverse, okay.
Yeah, and much like you could say the Presbyterian Church is diverse too. PCUSA is probably not as diverse in its perspectives on this, but the Presbyterian faith is. And one of the things I learned from some of my friends that are in other faith traditions, have said one of the things that you can't do, which will actually be a disservice to yourself, is to say that Christian nationalists are not Christian.
Right.
And the reason you can't say that is because they come from your branch of religion.
Right.
So you're not allowed to dismiss. You have to deal with it from within. And that came actually from a friend who's an imam, and said in much the same way that I can't say a militant Muslim is not a Muslim. I can say that's not my brand of Islam.
Right.
But I can't say they're not Muslim. And so I think that's also a helpful part of this conversation, because then the conversation is actually from within.
Right.
We're not saying, well, you're not, now let me tell you why you're a bad person. We're saying, no, from within, this is why it's not shouldn't be part of our faith tradition.
So I'm gonna give a commercial now. I think I have a little time.
Yeah.
Wednesday night at 7:00. There's gonna be an online discussion of this topic that I'm moderating. Sheila Sees Kennedy, who's Jewish, is on the panel, and Bo Underwood, who was here last Wednesday, who's a Allisonville Christian Church minister, are on the panel. I think it costs $5 to register, something like that. Go to the website of Indiana Council on World Affairs. Indiana Council on World Affairs, go to their programs and you'll see the link there. You have to register to get it, but it's gonna be a online discussion, 2 hours discussion, an hour worth of panel discussion, then another hour of people asking questions for an hour.
We're showing it here, right?
Doing it here.
We're go ahead, Jen.
We're thinking we might not show it here now that we realized it was 2 hours, but Karen registered for it.
Okay.
With the hopes of getting the recording afterwards, so
Okay.
we could add it to the resource
Okay.
list.
But anybody wants to do it, you don't have to stay for the 2 hours, but if you want to stay for the discussion, because it will bring in the Jewish perspective on this, which I think is a missing perspective on this. And again, Indiana Council on World Affairs, I'll be moderating. I'll be adding a little color commentary to this as well, keeping the questions going. So I hope at least some of you, Charlie?
Speaking as a lone Catholic, we are a very mixed bag. And, you know, I think a lot of folks will compromise because of the abortion issue, and that's how you kind of, you know, file the Supreme Court and whatnot. So a long conversation, but it's a very important one. Quick question I have for you, Don, because I know you study international law, and something that just really surprised me as a political scientist was when they moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, there were two speakers, and both of them represented white Christian nationalists, John
Yes.
Hagee and the guy named Jefferson,
Yeah.
represents a large congregation in Texas. And they both, without equivocation, said that we are in a religious war with, and they even pointed their finger to Tehran, and that we're gonna do what's unfolding now. How come there was not more outrage about that on every level? I mean, not just from our Christian religious, but from our American, this is just not how we
You know,
roll.
I wish I knew answers to those questions. The question is, why did all of this develop? By the way, it's not a new story. I point out to 2012 to say, I knew this was happening in 2012. It's not like we sort of missed this, right? We just missed it by silence. We just sat around, watched this happen, and now we're saying in 2024, by God, we have to do something about this.
Read Bradley Onishi's book, Prepared for War.
Right.
I mean, it goes, he says the real Kickstarter was, the Barry Goldwater campaign in 1964. I mean, and he traces, it's really.
And by the way, when he says preparing for war, he's literally saying,
Oh, yeah.
he's saying with weapons and arms, he says what happened at the Capitol building is just the forefront of this. We should expect to see.
Billy
it.
Graham's been completely convoluted. I mean, if you look at some of Billy Graham's original sayings and what they're saying now under the guise
Yeah.
of Billy Graham.
yeah.
So, but again, the message is, you all are intelligent people, you have friends, colleagues, they don't go to this church. Reach out to them and say, do something about this, go vote, go tell your neighbors about this, something, because otherwise silence becomes complicity. Okay, we have one more question. One more question, Jennifer? Yeah, right here.
It's uncomfortable. But I guess my question is, when we discuss this, do we discuss the whole picture if we don't call it white Christian nationalism? Just,
I think that's what people are beginning to call it.
Yeah.
They're beginning to call it white Christian nationalism because you see the differences between whites and blacks. Yeah, I think we should call it that. I think we should call it white Christian nationalism. The books haven't called it that. Most of them haven't.
well,
A couple of them.
they bounce back and forth
They do.
on your quotes. Some do,
Some
some
don't.
don't, in the same quote.
It's fair to call it, my opinion, white Christian nationalism because of this racist component.
Are we concerned, like what Reverend Shivers was saying, are we gonna alienate a group of folks by implication if you're white and a Christian? I don't know. I mean, the language is so delicate.
Well,
I just want to start a discussion. And it's been going on all the last couple of months here. That's going to continue.
Carol, what were you gonna say?
well, again, I got this from the Onishi book, but yeah, Christian nationalism is very different for our black brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with Christian, I mean, they believe that value that all people are created equal, which white Christian nationalism says,
Well,
Only men.
racism is clearly behind this
Yeah,
anti-immigrant sense.
there's several.
There's no doubt about it. You can look at the surveys on that. Okay, I don't want to go with anybody else.
One last thing that, okay, yeah, thank you.